My name is Jonathan Reyes, and what I'm about to tell you happened on May 16, 2025. I remember that date like it was branded into my spirit. It started like any other morning, but I had no idea it would end with me leaving my body behind and seeing something I never imagined. Something I've carried with me ever since. At the time, I was a theology lecturer at a small Catholic university in Buenos Aires. I'd spent the last 12 years teaching about church history, papal encyclicals, and the evolution of doctrine across centuries. But somewhere along the line, the faith I taught stopped feeling alive inside me. I could write papers on sacred tradition, but I couldn't feel the presence of God anymore. It was like I had been talking about someone I no longer knew. That emptiness grew so loud in my soul, I eventually canceled 2 weeks of classes, told my wife Marissa I needed space to think, and booked a flight to Rome without even telling my colleagues. I told myself it was for spiritual clarity, but the truth was, I was chasing something I didn't have words for. When I landed in Rome, it was just days after Pope Leo XIV was elected. He was the first American pope in the history of the Catholic Church, Robert Francis Prevost, originally from Chicago. I didn't know much about him then, only that he had done mission work in Peru and had a reputation for being pastoral, gentle, and unexpectedly grounded. The morning after I arrived, I went out to St. Peter's Square and watched him deliver one of his first blessings. He didn't seem like a man who wanted power. He didn't have that air of grandeur or calculation you sometimes expect in Vatican figures. He looked tired, but it was a sacred kind of tired, like someone who had spent a lifetime carrying people's pain and suddenly had the weight of the whole church resting on his shoulders. I remember standing there among the crowd, not praying exactly, just watching. I didn't know why, but something in my chest stirred in a way it hadn't for years. I didn't feel joy or peace. I felt anticipation, like something was coming, like I hadn't just come to Rome to rest. I'd come to witness something. For the next several days, I wandered the city without purpose. I visited chapels tucked between alleys, sat in silence under mosaics I couldn't interpret, and spoke with priests and pilgrims who had no idea how much I was unraveling inside. One night, I even walked to the outskirts of the Vatican wall, not knowing why I was drawn there. I just kept walking until I saw the Apostolic Palace in the distance, its old stones glowing under the orange of the Roman sunset. I remember whispering under my breath, "God, if you're real, if you still speak, I'm listening." I don't know why I said it. It just came out of me. I didn't feel an answer, but I didn't feel alone either. Then came May 16th. That morning, I was sitting across from the Apostolic Palace drinking coffee when I saw a black sedan pull up quietly at the edge of the courtyard. A man stepped out wearing simple black clergy robes. No press, no entourage. He moved slowly, almost reverently, and though I'd never seen him in person, I recognized his face immediately. It was Cardinal Mateo Jimenez, once the Archbishop of Cebu in the Philippines. I'd studied his writings back in seminary. He was known for his missionary work and his deep empathy for the poor. And now, he was walking through the palace gates for what would be a private audience with Pope Leo XIV, an audience that hadn't been publicly announced or scheduled. I stood up without thinking, coffee in hand, and watched as the Swiss guards opened the gate just long enough for him to enter. The doors closed behind him like a book being sealed, and I remember the strange pressure rising in my chest. I felt dizzy. I thought maybe it was just the heat or the jet lag, but something was happening in my body that didn't make sense. My vision blurred. My heart slammed against my ribs. I took one step backward and then collapsed. Just like that. No warning, no pain at first, just an overwhelming silence and then blackness. I should have been terrified. I should have felt panic. But the next thing I remember wasn't fear. It was peace. I opened my eyes, or what felt like my eyes, and I wasn't on the stone street anymore. I wasn't in Rome. I wasn't anywhere I could name. The space around me felt endless, like a cathedral of light. There were no walls, no altar, no ceiling, but I felt enclosed in something holy. Not in a building, but in God. His presence didn't have a shape, but it had weight. A beautiful, heavy kind of stillness that wrapped around me like breath. I felt like I had been returned to something I had forgotten. A truth so real it made everything I had ever doubted fall away like dust. I didn't know how long I was there, standing in that place of golden silence. But time didn't work the same way it does here. Could have been seconds or hours, it didn't matter. I wasn't asking questions anymore. I was simply receiving. Then something began to shift, not in the space around me, but in me. I felt pulled, as if I was being guided by something unseen, and the next moment I found myself no longer in the light, but somewhere else entirely. It looked like a private room, perhaps inside the Vatican, richly decorated yet humble. Two men were there. At first I could only see the backs of their heads, but then one of them turned, and I recognized him immediately. Pope Leo XIV. His features looked the same as they had from the balcony, but now there was something different. His eyes carried a depth I can't explain. He wasn't performing. He wasn't leading a crowd. He was in deep, soul-level conversation. And then I saw the other man. It was Cardinal Jimenez. They sat across from each other, not as politician and advisor, but as two broken vessels trying to hear the voice of God through the noise of the world. They weren't speaking loudly, but I could hear them as clearly as if they were next to me. The Pope asked something so simple, yet so loaded. "Will you walk with me?" Not as an order, not as a command, as an invitation. Cardinal Jimenez didn't answer right away. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking a little, and then he whispered, "Yes," but it wasn't triumphant. It was sorrowful, like he knew what the yes would cost him. And then he started to weep, right there in front of the Pope. Not out of fear, but because of the weight of what he had been asked. And I remember Leo reaching out, placing a hand on his shoulder, and saying, "This church is not built on policy. It is built on presence. Yours matters." When I heard those words, something in me shattered. All the theology I had learned, all the lectures I'd given, all the books I had studied, they meant nothing compared to that one truth. The church wasn't alive because of structure or strategy. It was alive because of obedience, because someone somewhere kept saying yes, even when it broke them. Then, just as suddenly as I had arrived in that room, I was back in the light, back in the cathedral of silence. But this time I was crying. I wasn't sad. I wasn't scared. I was overwhelmed, because for the first time in years, I had felt the heartbeat of God. Not in a mystical sense, but in a deeply personal one. I understood something in that moment that changed everything. The church wasn't dying, even though I had thought it was. It was groaning under the weight of its own transformation. God wasn't abandoning it. He was rebuilding it not from the top down, but from the inside out. And he was using people like Jimenez, people who were willing to lead not with control, but with compassion. And in that space, in that holy quiet, I felt something enter me. A task, maybe even a calling. I knew I wouldn't stay in that place. I knew I was being sent back. And I knew I couldn't go back unchanged. The return was fast and violent, like being pulled through water too quickly. One moment I was surrounded by light, and the next I was gasping for air on the cold stones outside the Apostolic Palace. Paramedics were around me, voices shouting in Italian, and someone pressed a wet cloth to my forehead. My chest burned like it was on fire. But even in the panic, I was calm. I heard a man's voice say, "He's back. He's breathing." And all I could do was whisper one word, "Yes." It wasn't a response to the medics. It wasn't to anyone around me. It was to God, to everything I had seen. I had said yes to, and I knew that would change everything. When I was finally stable enough to sit up, a nurse asked me if I remembered what happened. I looked at her and said, "I died." But I didn't go far. She thought I was delirious. Maybe I was. But something in me had been reborn. I had been allowed to witness something sacred, something not meant to be broadcast in headlines or dissected in theological circles. It was personal, it was holy, and it was real. In the days after I came back, I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. Not Marissa, not my colleagues at the university, not even my priest back home. It wasn't because I didn't believe it happened. It was because I didn't know how to speak it out loud. I would wake up in the middle of the night and hear Pope Leo's voice in my head, the echo of that quiet command. This church is not built on policy. It is built on presence. I would sit in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, staring at a crucifix on the wall, wondering what I was supposed to do with what I had witnessed. People around me thought I just fainted in the heat or had some kind of heart episode brought on by exhaustion. That's what the doctors said. Anyway, they ran every test. Everything came back clean. There was no reason for me to have collapsed. No reason for me to stop breathing. No reason for me to flatline. But I had. And I'd come back with something more than a second chance. I had come back with a burden. I started paying attention to the church again, but not in the way I used to. I didn't just read news stories or papal letters like a scholar looking for insights. I read them like a man looking for signs. And they were everywhere. The church was shifting, quietly but powerfully. You wouldn't notice it if you were only watching headlines, but if you listened between the lines, you could hear it. Pope Leo didn't make sweeping reforms right away. He didn't fire anyone or flip the Vatican upside down. What he did was subtler, slower. He listened. He traveled to places no pope had visited in decades. He met with bishops from villages, not just cathedrals. He stopped giving interviews and started giving audiences, private ones, personal ones. There were whispers that he was working on a new encyclical, one that wouldn't be about doctrine or dogma, but about healing. Some people in the media thought it was weakness. They said he wasn't doing enough. But I knew what he was doing. I had seen it. A year after my experience, Cardinal Jimenez was appointed to lead a newly formed council within the Vatican. It wasn't a high-profile job. It didn't come with ceremony. But those who were paying attention understood the weight of it. His new role was to oversee pastoral care in what they called emerging regions. Places where the church was growing rapidly but suffering deeply. War zones, refugee camps, urban slums. He wasn't there to govern. He was there to be present. And I remembered what the Pope had told him in that private meeting. Yours matters. I watched videos of Jimenez holding the hands of child migrants in Hungary, weeping with mothers in war-torn Sudan, washing the feet of the disabled in southern India. He wasn't trying to be a saint. He was just obeying the call. And that, I realized, was what true leadership looked like. Not applause, not elevation, but sacrifice. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't go back to the way things were. That was when I finally told Marissa what had happened to me. We were sitting on our porch one night, and I just broke down. I told her everything, the collapse, the Cathedral of Light, the meeting between Pope Leo and Cardinal Jimenez, the voice that told me I had come to see. She didn't laugh. She didn't question it. She just took my hand and said, "Then you need to tell others." And I knew she was right, because this wasn't just about what I had seen. It was about what the world needed to know. That the church wasn't crumbling. It wasn't irrelevant. It wasn't a relic. It was being reshaped by hands we don't always see, by prayers we never hear, by people whose yes to God costs them everything. And maybe, just maybe, I had been shown all of this not because I was holy, but because I had been asleep, because I needed to wake up. And now I had no excuse to stay quiet. After I told Marissa, the weight I'd been carrying didn't disappear, but it changed. It was no longer the burden of silence. It became the burden of truth. I wasn't just someone who had a near-death experience. I was a man who had been shown something sacred, something I had no choice but to carry. I didn't know where to start, so I began where I always had, in my classroom. But everything was different. I couldn't lecture the same way. I found myself pausing in the middle of lessons, looking at my students not as names on a roster but as souls. I started speaking more slowly, more personally. One day, I shared with them a version of what had happened. Not the supernatural parts, just the shift in me. I told them the church was changing, not through headlines, but through hidden acts of obedience. A few students stayed after class. One of them, a young woman named Karina, said, "I think I've been waiting to hear that for years." That's when I realized my story wasn't mine to protect. It was meant to wake people up. I started writing late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with nothing but my journal and a cup of tea. I wasn't writing a book. I wasn't trying to publish anything. I was just trying to capture what I had seen before it faded. But it never did. Every detail, the color of the light, the weight of the silence, the trembling voice of Cardinal Jimenez, stayed sharp in my memory, like God had engraved it into me. I began to feel like I had one foot on earth and one foot still in that holy space. I stopped chasing theology and started chasing presence. I'd walk into Mass and no longer see an altar. I'd see an encounter. Every sacrament became heavier, more real. Confession, which I'd once treated as ritual, became like breathing underwater for the first time. Eucharist, which I had dissected 100 different ways in the classroom, became overwhelming. Sometimes I couldn't even take it without weeping. I had come back different, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. The church itself was echoing with that same change. More and more priests were being appointed not for their credentials, but for their character. Bishops were being asked to spend time in mission fields before being given dioceses. Lay leaders were stepping forward, not as placeholders, but as prophets. And Pope Leo? He was moving in silence. I read reports about how he was holding long, unpublicized meetings with voices from the margins. Survivors of abuse, mothers of the poor, teenagers who had left the church and returned. He wasn't trying to impress the media. He was trying to listen to the Spirit. A new council was forming, one that included religious sisters, married couples, converts, and even former skeptics. It was clear, Pope Leo was building a church not from the top down, but from the wounded up. And as I watched it unfold, I remembered that cathedral of light. I remembered the voice that told me I had come because I needed to see. I hadn't just seen a meeting, I had seen a movement. That's when I made a decision that scared me to my core. I resigned from my position at the university. Not because I stopped believing in education, but because I believed too much in what couldn't be taught from a podium. I needed to be where the church was bleeding. I wrote a letter to my department, packed my office, and took a job as a volunteer pastoral worker in a shelter in southern Argentina. I worked with the addicted, the homeless, and the forgotten. I prayed with them, cried with them, and confessed beside them. I preached fewer sermons, but I held more hands. I didn't have answers for their pain. I didn't offer philosophy. I offered presence, just like Cardinal Jimenez, just like Pope Leo. And in those moments, in those long, aching nights in the shelter's chapel, I understood what it really meant to lead like Christ. It wasn't about getting credit. It was about getting low, about kneeling beside the wounded and saying, "You matter." And in some quiet, beautiful way, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was starting to matter too. Months passed at the shelter, but time didn't feel linear anymore. Each day was packed with stories. Some broken, some hopeful, all painfully real. I met a man named Elias who had lost everything to heroin addiction, and a woman named Rosa who had buried 3 of her children before she was 30. They didn't ask me for theology. They asked me where God was in their pain. And I didn't give them long-winded answers. I told them the truth. I told them that I had once died and seen something I didn't deserve to see. I told them that the church wasn't a marble fortress in Rome. It was them. It was Elias crying during morning prayer. It was Rosa singing to herself as she washed dishes in the shelter's kitchen. I told them that God didn't need them to be perfect. He needed them to say yes. And every time they did, even in small ways, I could feel the cathedral of light again. Not with my eyes, but with my soul. One evening, I was invited to give a testimony at a small church nearby. It wasn't a grand affair. Maybe 50 people, all from poor neighborhoods, some fresh out of prison, others just trying to stay sober for one more day. I didn't bring notes. I didn't wear anything special. I stood at the front of that modest chapel and shared the story I've been telling you now. The collapse outside the Apostolic Palace, the room where Pope Leo and Cardinal Jimenez spoke in trembling voices, the golden silence that taught me more than any textbook ever had. I told them that I didn't see a church dying. I saw a church being born again in the lives of people who had nothing but hope. I expected confusion, maybe even skepticism, but what happened after stunned me. No one clapped, no one moved. They just sat there, many of them crying quietly, not because my story was powerful, but because they knew it was true. Not the details, not the supernatural stuff, but the heart of it. They recognized the voice of God in it because they had heard it too, in their own suffering. That night changed everything. Word spread in the surrounding neighborhoods, and soon I was being asked to visit other churches, youth groups, and community centers. Not because I was special, but because people were desperate for something real. They didn't want perfection. They wanted presence. They didn't want programs. They wanted prayer. The more I spoke, the more I realized this wasn't about me at all. I was just a witness, and every time I shared what I had seen, something ignited in the room. Not emotional hype, but quiet conviction. People began confessing things they had buried for years. Others returned to Mass after decades away. One night, a young man came up to me, shaking. He said, "I had a dream about a room just like the one you described. Before I ever heard your story, I didn't have the words. I just held him as he cried." God was moving, not in the way the world documents, but in the way the Spirit always does, subtly, deeply, forever. As for Pope Leo and Cardinal Jimenez, I've never met them, not in the flesh anyway, but I don't need to. I carry their moment with me. I follow the updates quietly, reading everything I can about the shifts happening under this papacy. I've heard that Pope Leo continues to meet in secret with those outside the corridors of power. Farmers, migrants, women in ministry, abuse survivors, fallen away Catholics. He rarely makes public declarations, but you can feel his fingerprints on everything. There's a new tone in the church now, a humility, a hunger, a return to what matters. I believe with all my heart that this isn't just a papal strategy. It's a divine movement, a recentering of the church not on law, but on love, not on image, but on intimacy with Christ. And every time I see a photo of Pope Leo holding the hand of a sick child or Cardinal Jimenez speaking quietly in a war-torn village, I remember the golden cathedral. I remember the presence. And I whisper again what I whispered the day I woke up on the Roman stones. Yes, it's been 3 years since that morning in Rome, but not a day goes by that I don't feel the weight of it. Sometimes it comes in dreams, sometimes in the quiet moments before dawn when the house is still, and I sit by the window with my rosary and listen to the world exhale. The light I saw in that place, it hasn't left me. I don't mean that in a metaphorical sense. I mean it truly hasn't left me. It's in everything now. I see it in the tired eyes of the volunteers at the shelter, in the trembling hands of the old man who walks to Mass even when his knees are failing. I hear it in the laughter of street children playing with a soccer ball made of rags. I feel it in the sacred pauses between words when someone says, "I don't know how to pray, but can you sit with me?" That golden silence, that living peace, has taught me to stop measuring holiness by eloquence or theology or public approval. Holiness is often invisible. It shows up in whispered obedience, in small acts that don't make headlines, in yes that cost everything. And that's the message I want to leave you with. That's the reason I've told this story, not because I want to convince you of a miracle, but because I need you to remember something you already know deep down. The church isn't a building. It's not a set of rules or a structure of power. It's a body, a living, breathing body, and it's wounded. It's imperfect, but it's also beautiful and alive and rising. There's a reason God showed me that moment between Pope Leo and Cardinal Jimenez. It wasn't just for me. It was a glimpse into what he's doing all over the world, in quiet hearts, in forgotten places, in people who have nothing to offer but their presence. God is rebuilding his church through humility, through mercy, through presence. And that means he's rebuilding it through you. Yes, you. You don't have to be famous. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to say yes. If you're listening to this and you feel like you've fallen too far, like your faith is too cold or your life too broken, let me tell you something. You're exactly who God wants to speak to. You're not too late. You're not disqualified. You're invited. Right now, right here. Maybe you haven't had a near-death experience. Maybe you've never heard a voice from heaven. But I promise you, if you quiet your heart, even for just a moment, you'll hear the same whisper I did. A voice saying, "Will you walk with me?" A voice that doesn't demand perfection, just honesty, just presence. Maybe that's why I died, so I could come back and look you in the eyes, through the screen, and tell you that you matter, that your presence matters, that your yes to God, however messy or uncertain it may feel, can change everything. Not just for you, but for the people around you who are waiting for someone to show them it's possible. So here's what I'm asking. If anything in this story touched your heart, if you felt even a flicker of something in your spirit, don't let it go. Don't scroll past it. Don't stuff it down and pretend it didn't happen. God is knocking, not with thunder, but with presence. Open the door. Reconnect with Him. Pray even if it's clumsy. Show up to Mass even if it's been years. Reach out to someone you've wronged. Forgive someone you swore you never would. And if this story lit a fire in you, share it. Share it with someone who's tired, someone who's questioning, someone who's drifted so far they've forgotten what light feels like. Let them know they're not alone. Let them know the church isn't finished. It's just getting started. And we are all a part of it. Like I said, I died in Rome, and God showed me the future of the church. Now it's your turn to help build it. If the story stirred something in your heart, don't ignore it. Leave a comment sharing what part spoke to you the most. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next testimony. Like this video to help more people hear what God is doing in hidden places. And most importantly, share it with someone who needs hope. The church is rising again, one heart at a time. Maybe today that heart is yours.